8th Avenue in Midtown is the gateway to the most visited spots in the world. But when 60 million tourists arrive every year, this is what they're seeing.
People in distress.
So Midtown Manhattan is supposed to be the center of the universe, but when you look around, you'll see the obvious signs of a humanitarian crisis just getting worse every single day. Which is strange because for months the city's been trying to clean up this area and help move the homeless off the streets. But the problem is, they've got nowhere else to go.
The city has launched what it calls Operation Front Door. It's a crackdown on issues city leaders say are affecting tourism and people who work in Midtown.
We're dealing with those who are under the influence that are just loitering in the area. We're dealing with those with severe mental health issues in the area. We're dealing with Mickey and Spider-Man not staying in the right area they're supposed to be.
Business owners like Ollie are also feeling the impact. He shared these pictures of what he claims he deals with on a regular basis outside of his clothing store.
We don't have that back where we are. We kind of just keep our head down and keep going.
If you live in New York or just came here to visit, you've probably seen this, especially around Times Square.
Is it just about putting more cops on the streets near Times Square?
So the mayor actually says it's more than that. He says you need to have the sanitation department to get rid of the trash.
Yeah.
You need to have the mental health department to come in and deal with the homeless.
The peer-to-peer outreach has connected over 100 people so far with services. But if that's the case, many wonder why there's still so much despair on display.
So look at this. Midtown Manhattan has a homeless crisis, but there are 15 different homeless service providers right here. And critics say nobody's connecting the dots between these facilities and the growing homeless crisis in this very neighborhood, because they say doing that would reveal that progressive solutions to homelessness aren't all they've cracked up to be. Which is a shame, because New York City plans to spend $4 billion on homeless services next year, which is what they spent on homeless services this year, accomplishing the unfortunate results we see all around us. But what our progressive leaders tell us is that homelessness is very complicated, with many factors leading to its growth, not just here in New York, but all across the country. However, the city's critics maintain that the reasons for our surging homeless crisis are entirely self-inflicted, because although public intoxication is part of this issue, the city seems to have no issue allowing the sale of dangerous products that shatter people's lives and destroy families. But it gets even worse, because critics say the city has no problem also allowing other types of illegal behavior that those who are victims of certain items might engage in order to fund what is a sad downward spiral. Like rampant retail theft, which is so bad here, stores in Midtown employ armies of security guards. And when you look at the shelves, you'll see more products locked up than we have prisoners in our jails, which are empty because we don't punish stealing, and critics say stealing allows vulnerable individuals to fund bad habits by reselling stolen merchandise to predatory retail criminals, who see the vulnerable as expendable petty crooks who won't go to jail if caught stealing up to $1,000 worth of stuff. And this brings us to the real reason why we seem to have a growing homeless crisis in this city that is just out of control. Our laws protect those who engage in deviant behavior and give them unlimited second chances every time they get caught, while simultaneously not going far enough to punish those who profit from human suffering by taking advantage of the vulnerable or by selling things to people that are bad for them, setting a massive trap those with problems fall into and never get out of. And although arresting our way out of this problem isn't feasible or a good idea to begin with, something's gonna have to be done to get the worst actors on our streets off of our streets, because they're what's contributing to everything we see. But as you're about to see, the city is determined to clean up this part of town because they don't want problems here to affect tourism, which could cost the city billions of dollars. However, they've been working on Midtown since June, and since then, things have only gotten worse, which has many people wondering if Midtown Manhattan is now so far gone that it has completely passed the point of salvaging. So here we are by Penn Station and Madison Square Garden, which you see there. Behind me, you've got a beautiful view of the Empire State Building. And not only is this a very historic part of town, it's one of the first parts of town that people see when they arrive here. And that's something that the city is very concerned about, because it is the center of a humanitarian homeless crisis.
And it's not at all the portrait New York leaders are looking to paint.
It's significant, and that's why we're all working together.
Since February, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg teamed up with Assembly member Tony Simone.
A lot of these folks need to be helped. They don't need to be just we're not going to arrest ourselves out of the problem.
So here we have an interview with our district attorney and another elected official, and right away it's controversial because the first thing that they say is that we're not going to arrest our way out of this, which is true. And our leaders say that instead we're going to service our way out of this crisis, even though there are already 15 homeless service providers in this area. You've got shelters, you've got medical facilities, and again, 15 of them, that's a lot. Critics right now are saying that with this critical mass of services right here, there's more than enough help for the people who want access to it to get into it, which is why you've now got some people saying that more needs to be done than just services, or things here aren't going to change. In fact, they may even continue to grow. Because according to one local resident, she's learned to be extremely vigilant when walking the streets in her own neighborhood, especially at night. And you've got business owners saying that when they try to open up in the morning, they'll commonly find people sleeping in their entryways. And some businesses, like this McDonald's, have a full-time security guard now to deal with elevated levels of crime inside their establishment. But to many, the real crime here is that this neighborhood has been falling apart for months, years even, and nothing's been done about it. And 2 months ago, we heard about how all of that was going to change because there was a new initiative with 25 city agencies who were going to swoop in and save Midtown. But that hasn't happened. Instead, the only results we do have are from the hardworking sanitation employees, who are doing an incredible job keeping the sidewalks looking the way that they are. This is tough work. And that's a job that has to be done every single day, day after day. It never gets any easier. They're doing a fantastic job, but the humanitarian element of this crisis is still here. It might look better for tourists, but the human suffering in this neighborhood is still on display for everyone to see. And it looks like nothing's being done to get people off the streets, even though the city spends millions of dollars to do it every single year.
The peer-to-peer outreach has connected over 100 people so far with services. But if that's the case, many wonder why there's still so much despair on display.
Takes months for them to establish a relationship with these folks to get them the help they need.
Simone lives nearby.
Now, to those of us who aren't homeless, the idea of living outside on the street exposed to the elements and on top of concrete isn't something that crosses our minds. Yet every day, hundreds of people are sleeping outdoors in this neighborhood, and it's taken months just to get 130 people off the streets and into a stable living situation. And if there's a free place out there for someone to stay and they don't want it, it reveals that there is something seriously wrong going on. Not just with the entire situation out here in Midtown, but also potentially with the method of outreach that's going on, leading many to question how effective those outreach services actually are. And on top of that, the city's critics are now saying that, hey, we should bring back something called involuntary commitment, and the reason they're arguing for that is because they say that somebody who is a danger to themselves and others doesn't have a right to do that in a public place like the middle of New York City. This opinion piece argues that the only way to clean up Midtown is to bring the mentally ill off the streets, even if they refuse help. And that's an incredibly frightening idea to many because it means that people will lose their freedom under the direction of somebody else who doesn't have to live with those consequences. And to me, that's pretty frightening because if the same folks, or agencies rather, that are in charge of cleaning up Midtown and can't seem to do it, if they're the ones making the determination on who's allowed to be out on the streets and who's not, there probably will be some mistakes. Yet at the same time, the idea of allowing someone who's obviously in distress to suffer and refuse help and just continue to stay in a downward spiral is also appalling. And that's got many people wondering if the city's even capable of finding a middle ground between personal freedom and getting people off the streets in a humane way. But now, things have gotten to a point where you've got some folks saying that we need to figure out what to do, and we need to do it quickly because the longer we wait, the more people there are that are suffering, and the more businesses there are which are also struggling to pay their rent and provide services to their customers. And a lot of those cater to the tourist industry, which the city is really worried about.
In fact, Wild says she fielded safety concerns from fashion execs during New York Fashion Week.
I see homelessness. It's not good.
While she says it hasn't cut into tourism's $74 billion business, it has led to more retail and restaurants opening in Brooklyn over Manhattan.
So here we get some interesting information. Apparently this isn't affecting tourism in a way that the city is able to measure, but we do know that businesses are choosing not to open up here, and instead they're going as far away as parts of Brooklyn to set up shop. And you've got observers saying that if businesses don't want to do anything in this neighborhood, eventually that's going to affect tourism negatively. Because the whole reason tourists come here is because there's all kinds of stuff to do, and if shops aren't open because nobody wants to work there, there is less to do. But as bad as things up here might be for tourists, tourists, for businesses, and for local residents, there's another angle to this that doesn't add up. And that angle is that New York City is spending millions of dollars every single year on mental health services. They're providing it in this area, but they just aren't getting any results. Well, that's not exactly true. They've gotten some results, which is that 130 people have been gotten off the streets into a better place. But with the hundreds of needy folks that are still out here right now, it looks like more should and can be done. But this brings us to a new controversy, which includes how the city goes about reaching out to those who are vulnerable. And apparently outreach is handled by nonprofit groups who approach those who are vulnerable, see how they're doing, ask them if they need help, and record the fact that an interaction took place. But apparently they don't record the results of that interaction as to whether or not that person was actually helped, just that they were approached. And what that means is even though the city spends millions of dollars on outreach, we don't know what the results of that outreach actually looks like. And while the mayor and his administration seem to be trying to do their best to take action in this neighborhood that has a meaningful effect, many of our elected officials still feel that the best way to help people is with more of the same types of outreach services that are already being provided, which critics say are part of the problem and will just make things here worse, dooming Midtown to remain in its present condition for a long, long time.
Who are under the influence that are just loitering in the area. We're dealing with those with severe mental health issues in the area. We're dealing with Mickey and Spider-Man not staying in the right area they're supposed to be.
The mayor also mentioned he likes...
So that was Mayor Adams at a press conference discussing some of the issues that Midtown is facing. He's specifically concerned with people who might be in an ill-framed state of mind, along with large groups of people who are loitering in this area. But he's also mentioned some other issues, specifically people who are in the costume character role who aren't where they're supposed to be, as well as the idea of illegal street vending, which is also a huge problem up here. And what that reveals is that this neighborhood is plagued by an overall level of lawlessness that is just contributing to this critical mass of issues in one particular part of town. And this progressive tolerance for lawlessness doesn't just hurt New York City's most vulnerable, the homeless. It's also hurting businesses, it's also hurting residents, and it will hurt tourism at some point, even if the city says they can't measure it right now. Because for the city to say that businesses are shutting down and leaving, but tourism's unaffected, kind of doesn't make sense. At a minimum, declining business activity should be a canary in the coal mine moment, so to speak. And to many people, there's a direct connection between the overall level of lawlessness that we've decided to tolerate in our city and the growing homeless crisis that is now before us, which has some people saying the city's new actions to clean up this neighborhood might be headed in the wrong direction.
The city has launched what it calls Operation Front Door. It's a crackdown on issues city leaders say are affecting tourism and people who work in Midtown.
Pedicabs line up outside Grand Central, but within minutes, the NYPD dismantled more than 24 of them Wednesday night.
This is one of the locations where...
Wow, that's pretty ridiculous, and I don't think most people have anything against a hardworking pedicab driver. That's a tough job. But when you take a closer look at some of these bikes, you see how out of control lawlessness affects not just the city's most vulnerable, but also those who work for a living. For example, the city says none of these are supposed to have motors, but all 5 bikes out here do have motors. And 3 out of the 5 have speakers, which aren't supposed to be there. Now, if you're in the pedicab business and you're trying to play by the rules, good luck, because your competitors aren't doing that. If their bikes all have speakers and yours doesn't, who's going to offer a more enjoyable experience to their customer? And if your bike doesn't have one of these really cool looking mid-drive motors to drive the chain, how long are you going to be able to work before you get tired? Not as long as your competitors. Now, personally, I've got an e-bike, and I don't think there's a problem with these things having motors as long as they go the right speed limit and don't put people in danger. But when a city allows lawlessness pretty much everywhere, it puts the law abiding at a disadvantage and requires them to become lawless if they want to keep up. And now you've got a situation where everyone's breaking the law, even people who didn't get up in the morning with that as their plan. But there's actually another issue going on here that is much, much worse and more controversial.
Next, we went to Broadway near 40th Street, where an illegal vendor got away from police by foot and left behind counterfeit items.
Got Gucci sunglasses.
The NYPD says businesses in Times Square complain customers are...
Yes, that's right. The never-ending problem of people with briefcases or towels on the ground selling fake counterfeit items all over this part of town. That's another thing that's been allowed here for years, just like modified pedicabs, which are everywhere, and nothing's ever really been done about it. And now you've got scammers all over the place with fake items, preying upon those who might not know any better, especially when it comes to the AirPods that are in a box. If you see something like that and it's out on the street, it's probably not a real pair of AirPods Maxes. But what we're looking at here on the homelessness crisis, it's related to all of these other issues facing Midtown, which are also allowed to just happen all the time. The whole place is the sum of its parts. That's what we're witnessing here. And that's got some suggesting it's time to try some basic common sense solutions instead of whatever we've been doing that allowed things to get to the point they're at today. And this does not involve rounding up the most vulnerable and putting them in jail just for being on the streets. And you've now got some folks suggesting that if you have indeed hordes of people on the streets of our city who are too busy using substances that they shouldn't be using to contemplate getting off the streets to begin with, there may in fact need to be some sort of intervention in their lives. And the mayor's crackdown on general lawlessness is probably a good idea. After all, if the city has laws and none of them are enforced, nobody's going to obey them, and everybody's going to think this is the wild, wild west and that they can do whatever they want out here. And if you don't let this turn into the wild, wild west, you will have less people who wind up as the victims of crime or behavior that the city says are illegal. What do you think about that? Do we tolerate too much crime in New York? Is that why many vulnerable people find themselves in difficult situations that are hard to get out of? How would you do your best to help the homeless? Is the city doing its best? Let me know. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.